Continuing Alexander from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Hugh Clough. But they were soon interrupted by Hephaestion's falling stick of a fever, in which, being a young man and a soldier too, he could not confine himself to so exact a diet as was necessary, for whilst his physician Glaucus was gone to theatre, he ate a fowl for his dinner, and drank a large draught of wine, upon which he became very ill, and shortly after died. At this misfortune Alexander was so beyond all reason transported that, to express his sorrow, he immediately ordered the manes and tails of all his neighbors and mules to be cut, and threw down the battlements of the neighboring cities. The poor physician he crucified, and forbade playing on the flute or any other musical instrument in the camp a great while, till directions came from the oracle of Ammon, and enjoined him to honor Hephaestion and sacrifice to him as a hero. Then, seeking to alleviate his grief in war, he set out, as it were, to hunt and chase of men, for he fell upon the Cassaans and put the whole nation to the sword. This was called a sacrifice to Hephaestion's ghost, in a sepulchre and a monument, and the adorning of them. He intended to bestow 10,000 talents, and designing that the excellence of the workmanship and the singularity of the design might outdo the expense, his wishes turned above all other artists to Sesicrates, because he always promised something very bold, unusual, and magnificent in his projects. Once, when they had met before, he had told him that, of all the mountains he knew, that of Athos and Thrace was the most capable of being adapted to represent the shape and lineaments of a man, that if he pleased to command him, he would make it the noblest and most desirable statue in the world, which, in its left hand, should hold a city of 10,000 inhabitants, and out of its right should pour a copious river into the sea. Though Alexander declined this proposal, yet now he spent a great deal of time with the workmen to invent and contrive others, even more extravagant and sumptuous. Now, as a side note, Kirk, which connects to some stuff in Greek, but to a degree, but Kirk means a hero shrine. So, and from that we get our word church. And of course, in the Christian sense, they're like, well, Jesus is the one we worship. In some churches, it's the saints too. But I'm not worshiping any heroes, but that's the whole idea there. So when people call something a church, so something new rises up and calls their thing a church, you know it's about worshiping the leader as a god. As he was upon his way to Babylon, Nearchus, who had sailed back out of the ocean, up the mouth of the river Euphrates, came to tell him that he had met with some Chaldean diviners, who had warned him against Alexander's going thither. Alexander, however, took no thought of it, and went on, and when he came near the walls of the place, he saw a great many crows fighting with one another, some of whom fell down just by him. After this, being privately informed that Apollodorus, the governor of Babylon, had sacrificed, to know what would become of him, he sent for Pythagoras, the soothsayer, and on his admitting the thing, asked him in what condition he found the victim, and when he told him the liver was defective in its lobe, a great presage, indeed, said Alexander. However, he offered Pythagoras no injury, and was sorry that he had neglected Nearchus's advice, and stayed for the most part outside the town, removing his tent from place to place and sailing up and down the Euphrates. Besides this, he was disturbed by many other prodigies. A tame donkey fell upon the biggest and handsomest lion that he kept and killed him by a kick. And one day, after he had undressed himself to be anointed and was playing at ball, just as they were going to bring his clothes again, the young men who played with him perceived a man clad in the king's robes, with a diadem upon his head, sitting silently upon his throne. They asked him who he was, to which he gave no answer after a good while, till at last, coming to himself, he told them that his name was Dionysius, that he was of Bithynia, that for some crime of which he was accused he brought thither from the seaside, and had been kept long in prison, that Serapis appeared to him, had freed him from his chains, conducted him to that place, and commanded him to put on the king's robe and diadem, and to sit where they found him, and to say nothing. Alexander, when he heard this, by the direction of his soothsayers, put the fellow to death, but he lost his spirits and grew diffident of the protection and assistance of the entities, and suspicious of his friends. His greatest apprehension was of Antipater and his sons, one of whom, Eulaus, was his chief cupbearer, and Cassander, who had lately arrived and had been bred up in Greek manners. The first time he saw some of the barbarians adore the king, could not forbear laughing at it aloud, which so incensed Alexander that he took him by the hair with both hands and dashed his head against the wall. Another time, Cassander would have said something in defense of Antipater to those who accused him, but Alexander interrupted him, saying, "What is it you say? Do you think people, if they had received no injury, would come such a journey only to calumniate your father?" To which, when Cassander replied that their coming so far from the evidence was a great proof of the falseness of their charges, not exactly, Alexander smiled and said those were some of Aristotle's sophisms, which would serve equally on both sides, and added that both he and his father should be severely punished if they were found guilty of the least injustice towards those who complained, all which made such a deep impression of terror in Cassander's mind that long after, when he was king of Macedonia and master of Greece, what's the verb there? Because you do say Greek. You don't pronounce the C as anything but a K. But as he was walking up and down at Delphi, and looking at the statues, at the sight of that of Alexander, he was suddenly struck with alarm, and shook all over. His eyes rolled, his head grew dizzy, and it was long before he recovered himself. When once Alexander had given way to fears of supernatural influence, his mind grew so disturbed and so easily alarmed that if the least unusual or extraordinary thing happened, he thought it a prodigy or presage, and his court was thronged with the diviners and priests whose business it was to sacrifice and purify and foretell the future. There's a lot more to being a prophet of any sort than making claims like this. So miserable a thing is incredulity and contempt of divine power on one hand, and so miserable also superstition on the other, which, like water, where the level has been lowered, flowing in and never stopping, fills the mind with slavish fears and follies, as now in Alexander's case. But upon some answers which were brought him from the oracle concerning Hephaestion, he laid aside his sorrow, and fell again to sacrificing and drinking, and having given Nearchus a splendid entertainment, after he had bathed, as was his custom, just as he was going to bed, at Medius's request, he went to supper with him. Here he drank all the next day, and was attacked with a fever, which seized him, not as some right after he had drunk of the bowl of Hercules, nor was he taken with any sudden pain in his back, as if he had been struck with a lance, for these are the inventions of some authors who thought it their duty to make the last scene of so great an action as tragical and moving as they could. Aristobulus tells us that in the rage of his fever and a violent thirst he took a draught of wine, upon which he fell into delirium, and died on the 30th day of the month Dacius. But the journals give the following record. On the 18th day of the month he slept in the bathing room on account of his fever. The next day he bathed and removed into his chamber, and spent his time in playing and dice with Medius. In the evening he bathed and sacrificed and ate freely, and had the fever on him through the night. On the 20th, after the usual sacrifices and bathing, he lay in the bathing room and heard Nearchus's narrative of his voyage and the observations he had made in the great sea. The 21st he passed in the same manner, his fever still increasing, and suffered much during the night. The next day the fever was very violent, and he had himself removed and his bed set by the great bath, and discoursed with his principal officers about finding fit men to fill up the vacant places in the army. On the 24th he was much worse, and was carried out of his bed to assist in the sacrifices, and gave order that the general officers should wait within the court, whilst the inferior officers kept watch without doors. On the 25th he was removed to his palace on the other side of the river, where he slept a little, but his fever did not abate, and when the generals came into his chamber he was speechless, and continued so the following day. The Macedonians, therefore, supposing he was dead, came with great clamors to the gates, and menaced his friends, so that they were forced to admit them, and let them all pass through unarmed by his bedside. The same day Pathan and Seleucus were dispatched to the temple of Serapis to inquire if they should bring Alexander thither, and were answered by the entity that they should not remove him. On the 28th, in the evening, he died. This account is, most of it, word for word, as it is written in the diary. At the time, nobody had any suspicion of his being poisoned, but upon some information given 6 years after, they say Olympius put many to death and scattered the ashes of Iolaus, then dead, as if he had given it him. But those who affirm that Aristotle counseled Antipater to do it, and that by his means the poison was brought, adduced one Hagnothemis as their authority, who, they say, heard King Antigonus speak of it, and tell us that the poison was water, deadly cold as ice, distilled from a rock in the district of Nanocris, which they gathered like a thin dew, and kept a donkey's hoof, for it was very cold and penetrating, that no other vessel would hold it. However, most are of opinion that this is a mere made-up story, no slight evidence of which is that during the dissensions among the commanders, which lasted several days, the body continued clear and fresh, without any sign of such taint or corruption, though it lay neglected in a close, sultry place. Roxana, who was now with child, and upon that account much honored by the Macedonians, being jealous of Statria, sent for her by counterfeit letter, as if Alexander had been still alive, and when she had her in her power, killed her and her sister, and threw their bodies into a well, which they filled up with the earth, not without their privity and assistance of Perdiccas, who at that time immediately followed the king's death under the cover of the name Archidaas, whom he carried about him as a sort of guard to his person, exercised the chief authority. Archidaas, who was Philip's son by an obscure woman of the name of Philina, was himself of weak intellect, not that he had been originally deficient either in body or mind. On the contrary, in his childhood he had shown a happy and promising character enough, but a diseased habit of body, caused by drugs which Olympius gave him, had ruined not only his health, but his understanding. Now, some of the ancient Greek drugs were lost, but yeah, all cultures had issues with that, pretty much.